I'm Arshad Mansoor. I'm the president and CEO of Electric Power Research Institute. And we have Jules Kortenhorst, president and CEO of Rocky Mountain Institute. Denny was supposed to introduce us, but I'm sure he'll be back. And he is back. We can see Denny now. Denny, passing on to you. Well, looks like Denny's Murphy is still visiting his house. So maybe what we can do, Jules, is let me pass it on to you. Let's start the conversation, but please use the chat session. Denny, Jules and I will be monitoring the chat, and we have a couple of staff who would be also looking at the chat session. And let's make it interactive, both in the chat group and also in the forum. So, Jules? Jules may be on mute as well.
Thank you, Arshad, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here at the start of a very important new year, an exciting new year with a lot of interesting opportunities emerging for the power industry. The U.S. is preparing to accelerate its energy transition under the Biden administration, and the timing for that is, in my mind, just right. Because when it comes to climate change, winning slowly is the same as losing. During this decisive decade, over the next 10 years, we need to really pick up the pace of the energy transition in order to start decarbonizing, particularly our power sector, as the cornerstone of the energy system going forward. Climate scientists tell us that in order to limit global warming to below 1.5 degrees, we not only need to aim for eliminating greenhouse gas emissions by the middle of the century, we also need to make real progress over the next 10 years, driving down global emissions by about 50%. Now, the good news is the global economy is already on a path to do that. Over the course of the last years, we've seen dramatic improvements in the pace and the cost effectiveness of deployment of renewable electricity. And that is quickly becoming the cornerstone of the energy system of the future. In fact, the Energy Transitions Commission, which is a global commission on the energy transition that I serve on, has laid out its report just in November of last year, illustrating how around the world we can build a green and sustainable energy economy on the basis of 4 pillars. First, clean electrons. We need electrons as the cornerstone of the energy system of the future, but they need to be low carbon. Second, incredible progress on energy efficiency. It has always been core to the system of thinking at RMI. Energy efficiency needs to triple over the next 10 years to get to that very clean and efficient energy system of the future. Third, we then need to use those efficient and clean electrons to electrify as much of the global economy as possible. We're already starting to see that emerge in the mobility sector. Mobility is relatively straightforward in terms of electrification, and we're going to see that crossover point where electric vehicles are becoming more cost-effective up front somewhere in the next couple of years, and that will build out a very rapid acceleration of electric mobility. But we're also going to electrify much more of our built environment. And that is another important growth sector for the power sector, a growth opportunity when we are starting to heat and cool our buildings with the help of clean electrons. And then finally, there is remaining about 25% of greenhouse gas emissions in industry, and what is often referred to as a hard-to-abate sectors. There we'll probably see that power becomes the path towards clean molecules like hydrogen, and power to X, power to hydrogen becomes the pathway for much of the decarbonization of the industry sector. In short, there's an enormous amount that is happening across the energy system, and the pace of those developments is rapidly accelerating. And that will get even more wind in the sails from a new Biden administration that clearly is committed to decarbonizing the U.S. economy, rejoining the Paris Agreement, and regaining for the United States a place in the innovation arena where much of this is playing out. So we are very upbeat, we're very optimistic. It is a crucial decade, but it is also a decade of great opportunity, and I look forward to our conversation around that, Arshad. Unmute.
Thank you, Jules. As Denny would have said if he was here, that having Rocky Mountain Institute and EPRI in the same forum maybe 10 years ago wouldn't have been a likely scenario. But we are all with the same vision. We want to accelerate our drive towards net zero, but do it reliably and affordably. And our research is enlightening us some possible pathways. But at the end goal is the same. What I'd like to do is spend just a few minutes to set the context on when we say we want to accelerate and get to the path towards the net zero. It's good to see what we have done in the past so we know how much more acceleration we need in the future. So with that in mind, if we set up 2005 as a baseline, not for any reason, but because 2005, some people use that as a Paris Climate Treaty baseline, in 15 years, which is 2020 January, before the pandemic, some of you may saw the news report that came out today that the pandemic has caused significant reduction of CO2, but that's a temporary thing. That's an unfortunate thing. We will get back, our economy will get back. And if you look at January of 2020 and 2005, the U.S. emission went from 6 gigaton per year to 5 gigaton, from 6 to 5. And if you look at in 2005, that 6 came from almost 40% from the electric sector, the way we produce electricity. Almost 37% came from transportation, the way we drive our car mobility. And the rest of it was the way we heat our home and other processes in industries. And then we went from 6 to 5, 1 gigaton in 15 years. So now you can see why we need to accelerate, because every 15 years, if we can get 1 gigaton, it'll take us a long way, well beyond 2050 to get to even close to net zero. And the work that we have done, that we say our Project 2X, we think if we can accelerate it double, 2X times than what we have done in the last 15 years, then we've got a good pathway to get to net zero. So how did we reduce 1 gigaton? We use 2 tools in our toolbox, as Jules mentioned. Tool 1, energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is a tool that will continue to have value, and that is one of the tools that actually impacts positively the underserved communities. And as we are looking at this transition, the equity and making sure that the underserved communities are properly addressed, that's a big thing. U.S. utilities spend $6 billion a year on energy efficiency. Our economy as a whole from 2005 to 2020 became 20% more efficient. So that was the first tool we used. In parallel, we used another tool, which is we continued to clean the electricity sector. And that continuation of cleaning the electricity sector, which is 30% cleaner now than in 2005, contributed to almost 80% of that 1 gigaton reduction. And that happened, 2/3 of it happened because we were able to convert coal to gas. And now I'm sure Jules and I will have a spirited dialogue on, well, what do you do with gas in the net zero world? But the other 1/3 came from renewables, wind and solar. And most importantly, in the last 15 years, we were able to preserve the largest carbon-free source of energy, which is nuclear in the United States. So that's the past. Now let's look into the future, and let's look into the near term. Near term is 10 to 15 years. In the next 10 to 15 years, instead of 1 gigaton, how can we go 2 gigaton? So 5 goes to 3, which means we are at 50% level economy-wide by 2030, 2035. So what our analysis is showing is what worked in the past works in the future. So energy efficiency continues to be a strong part. Cleaning the electric grid, that is an imperative. Our analysis shows that wind and solar with continued price reduction, we may have 3x to 4x time wind and solar coming in the next 10 years. But as we are doing that, we got to make sure we reimagine the grid, and the grid is ready in two perspectives. One, taking 3x to 4x times of renewables and integrate it. But also the third tool in the toolbox, we see tremendous opportunity in this next decade is electrification of transportation. By January 2020, the largest emitter is the transportation sector, no longer the electric sector. Jules mentioned 2 to 3 years' time, we'll see forced cost parity. But here's our biggest challenge. From a societal perspective, we will have to address it. An average U.S. household of four, $45,000 annual income. They have 2 cars, and their energy bill is $4,500. So that's 10% of their income. When EV reaches cost parity, so which means it is now affordable, if you convert both the cars to electric vehicle, they will save $1,000 a year. So if you think about stimulus check, think about $1,000 stimulus check that keeps on giving year after year and reduce their emission by 2/3. Very few opportunities we have had in the past decades where you can reduce emission 2/3 and you can save $1,000. But how will that underserved community or the average U.S. household be able to charge their cars? Public charging, if you look at high-speed charging, that's not coming in those communities. So this is a great opportunity for public-private partnership. Well, utilities can work with charging vendors, but also the government comes in and working together in the next 5 years. Let's put a 10x time charging infrastructure than what we have today. That's a great opportunity to deploy. So if we continue to do those things, get charging infrastructure ready, modernize the grid, continue to clean the grid, energy efficiency, we may get to another 1 gigaton in the next 10 years. We'll have to do another thing, which is we want to make sure we preserve the safe and reliable operation of the almost 100 gigawatt largest carbon-free source of energy that we have in U.S. today, which is nuclear. So we went to 2030 or 2035, and I'm going to pause because the next 15 years, the last 50% is where what our research is enlightening is we need tools, another tool in our toolbox, the fourth tool, which doesn't exist at a level that is reliable and affordable right now. This is the decade to supercharge innovation so that the fourth tool in the toolbox, low carbon resource, how can clean electricity produce clean molecules, hydrogen, liquid ammonia, synthetic fuel, and that will help us decarbonize hard to electrify sectors. So that's the pathway that we have going forward. I think it's a pathway that takes into account learnings of the past, but also brings in what we need to do in the future. And we are very optimistic that we would be able to, as technologists, we will get to net zero, and we will do it in the right way, and we'll need to make sure all of us are working together. So with that, I'm going to pass it on. I don't know, Rob, if you are on the line as well, maybe you can jump in as a moderator, and since Denny may still have a challenge.
Arshad, I am on the line. Let me see, Denny. We were going to check to see if your audio is back. So why don't we go ahead and while Denny continues to work on his audio, I'm going to jump in. We did have a question that I think is important. Both you and Jules painted the picture, Arshad, in terms of how we get there. And let me just summarize really quickly. Obviously, clean electrons from a supply perspective, incredibly important, and not to diminish its renewable storage and a host of other technologies, low carbon technologies that are going to support that. Energy efficiency key, electric mobility, buildings, decarbonizing the building stock and new construction, and then industry, of course, and low carbon carriers for industry. But one of the questions that came up as we look at this globally, how are we taking into consideration, say, developing economies where electricity is just evolving right now? How are we thinking about that as we think about decarbonization going forward? Jules, why don't I start with you, since you can provide some perspective from our RMI, and then Arshad, we'll flip that question over to you.
Yeah, that's an exciting set of developments, Tom. Thank you for that question. And what what we are seeing is that the shifts that we've noticed here in the United States, observed here in the developed world, are also happening in the developing world. The cost effectiveness of solar and wind outcompetes now new coal and new gas plants in the United States, but also does so in developing countries. In fact, gas is very cheap here in the United States, more expensive in many developing countries, so that makes renewables even more attractive in places like Africa and Southeast Asia. And yes, even new coal plants are starting to face significant competition from renewables. An analysis that we have done shows that, in fact, over the next 5 years, existing coal plants in most of the world will be outcompeted by new wind and new solar. So it pays to shut down an existing coal plant to build out more renewable capacity. So in these parts of the world, the challenge is not whether the technology can work. The challenge is not even whether the technology can pay for itself. The challenge is largely one of financing. Do these countries have the ability to bring to bear the financing capacity? Can they borrow enough money? Can they bring to bear the equity to invest in these new projects? But we have a very optimistic outlook about the pace in which renewables are helping these countries. One more point. It is, of course, also an incredibly powerful tool for energy access, because when we are talking about energy access, it's often been in distributed locations, in locations far away from urban centers, in places where there is no centralized grid. And there, in particular, solar is now a very cost-effective way of providing energy access. Just think about what we're facing right now, the pandemic. We need cold storage to bring vaccines to people all around the world. And what was not possible 10 years ago is now possible with cost-effective mini-grids in villages in Africa and in Southeast Asia. So we believe that there is a very upbeat outlook for the scale-up of renewables in developed countries around the world.
That's great, Jules, and especially as these countries develop, obviously the perspective of reliability and resiliency, a different definition in that area as they evolve, and opportunity to evolve with them. Arshad, rather than asking you that same question, I'm going to take advantage of another question that came up on the chat that got into a question really around what EPRI and RMI's opinion is around nuclear power. I think this is an important one in terms of as we think about affordability and we think about technology optionality and we think about net zero or low carbon technologies. Arshad, comments on that?
Well, Rob, I would address just a bit of that comment. As you know, I was born in Bangladesh, a developing country, and it's growing at 6 or 7% a year for the last 10 years. And if you look at the pathway, we just have to be realist. And the realism is renewables will play a big role. But if you think about a country like Bangladesh, size of Wisconsin, 160 million people, you don't have enough land to put solar. Wind resources are very scarce. Instead of cutting trees and burning it to heat our home, fossil fuel technologies are actually the first step. Natural gas could play a huge role. Nuclear could play a huge role. Every country will have to do it in their own way, and we have to make sure that we are bringing in the best technology. But where developing countries have an opportunity to leapfrog us in developed country is energy efficiency. The amount of energy that is needed per capita that we use in U.S., that we use in developing countries, it is opportunity for developing countries to use much less energy and do it in a much more efficient way. But let us not kid ourselves that we can do it just by wind and solar. It would be a significant part of the decarbonization. But just like in U.S., last 15 years, we have used natural gas to reduce our carbon emission. The biggest carbon emission in U.S. has been because of natural gas. We got to figure out what to do with natural gas in a net zero world. So let me answer the question on nuclear. And I've mentioned it a couple of times. 3 key strategies that our research is enlightening. First, in developed countries, U.S., we have to preserve reliable, safe, affordable operation of the nuclear power plant. You got almost 100 gigawatts, the largest source of carbon-free energy. in developing world, and we are seeing that, there will be these large 1,000-megawatt nuclear plants that are being deployed. We got to make sure it's done safely. But if you look at the next, we have to start reimagining nuclear. The first reimagination is these plants that operates today not only needs to be reliable and affordable, they need to be a producer of other sources, not just electricity, but they're producing hydrogen. They're producing steam. And this flexibility, there is significant work that INL, EPRI, and others are doing on reimagining how even a large nuclear plant works, because solar is going to be, solar and wind, 4x, 5x times. There will be time when we don't need electricity because we're getting it from solar and wind. What do you do with those large plants now? So reimagining flexibility is a key part of our research strategy. And the third is we need to even reimagine what the next nuclear plant looks like. Most likely will not be a 1,000-megawatt plant. Most likely will be a smaller plant. Most likely it will not be built on site. It will be actually fabricated using 3D printing, using powder metallurgy. And you have to look at from a U.S. perspective, you look at in the 80s, the research that the industry and EPRI did, that led to advanced light water reactor, which is the largest plants that we have worldwide. The U.S. was the leader in terms of Westinghouse, GE, and other companies. We are seeing very good sign from both private and public research to give that same advantage to U.S. to build the next generation small modular advanced reactors, which could be the next level of nuclear. So those three things: preserve what you got, reimagine what flexibility means, and reimagine what the next generation nuclear would look like. That really drives our research agenda and almost the global research agenda related to nuclear and the role of nuclear in a net zero world.
Great comments, Arshad. And I do want to pick up on that flexibility in just a moment, your flexibility comment, but I'm going to go to Jules and see, Jules, from an RMI perspective, the role of nuclear going forward. Maybe just allow you to make some comments.
Yeah, I agree completely with Arshad's first and second comments. Make sure the existing fleet can continue to operate safely and build on the flexibility. I'm personally, and here at RMI, we're more skeptical about the third, new nuclear. And it's not an ideological position, although in the past it may have been, but it's a very practical one. The learning curves of wind and solar, and now also offshore wind and battery storage, continue at an unbelievable pace. It ranges from somewhere like 14, 15% for onshore wind to 28% for solar and 22% for batteries. That means every time the globally installed capacity of any of these technologies doubles, the cost comes down with that percentage. That means that we're going to see wind and solar and storage become more and more and more cost effective. And when we peek into the future, we don't see anything that is slowing that down, at least for the next 5 to 10 years, maybe even longer. That means that the marginal cost of electrons becomes incredibly cheap on the basis of these technologies. And the question of the future is therefore much more, how do we flexibly integrate these, to a significant extent, distributed renewable energy resources into an electricity grid? And how do we make the supply of these flexible resources match demand rather than the other way around, demand matching supply? That is a very different approach than what has historically been nuclear, where costs have gone up, not down, and where it is a very stable base load, but it doesn't have necessarily that much flexibility. Will that innovation come in the nuclear arena? Will the costs come down and the flexibility arrive? Maybe, but I'm in a bit of a hurry. I've mentioned 50% reduction by 2030. We need to have a clean power system by 2035. I'm not sure whether nuclear can move fast enough with these new innovations that are necessary. I see much more of the excitement of the innovation in what is going to be triggered in particular by the FERC Order 2222, by the large-scale ramp-up of distributed resources, by the degree to which solar is going to be embedded in all new construction, by the unrelenting cost reductions of those technologies by the future flexibility that is being brought to bear by deploying the digital technologies to make our grid smart and let supply dance with demand rather than the other way around. That's sort of where we see the big opportunity of the future, Rob.
Great feedback, Jules, and I appreciate that. You touched on the question that I wanted to ask around distributed energy resources, which is ultimately we are looking at a much more dynamic, flexible grid being necessary to take advantage of all of these distributed energy resources that may be on the customer side as well as the utility side. Arshad, I'm just curious your perspective. Jules mentioned for 2222. What's your perspective on how the system needs to prepare for the distributed energy resources and maybe even take it down to a specific technology? Is there opportunity around vehicle to grid? Arshad?
I think that order, we already knew the role distributed energy resources will play in the decarbonization. That order just makes it possible at the federal level. Now we need to work federal and state. The policy side is the biggest challenge because in order to fully capitalize on distributed energy resources that are at the extremities of the grid, we need to modernize the grid. We need communication all the way to the extremities of the grid. That investment is authorized by Public Utility Commission. Without making that investment, without having the ability to visualize all the resources and the ability to dispatch them, I think we'll have a challenge. Technology-wise, I think there are so many opportunities. I used to say that, when you talk about energy storage, the best energy storage is the thermal envelope in your house and the hot water heater that you have in your house. That would bring flexibility. Vehicle to grid, I think we need to start first with grid to vehicle, which means sending smart signals so we are charging at the right time. But there is also opportunity. Imagine all the school buses in summer, what they're doing if they can electrify the fleet. So I think the opportunities of DER to provide a flexible resource. And one thing I didn't mention, our research is also showing that in U.S., in the next 10 years, we will need 30 gigawatt and maybe more of 2 to 4 hour flexible resource. That 30 gigawatt, to put it in perspective, is the amount of pumped hydro we have used over the last 5 decades to build. And that flexibility will come from batteries, most likely lithium-ion technology, when batteries become part of the grid, distribution, customer side transmission, but it will come from flexible load. And the FERC Order 2222 makes a huge opportunity for state to collaborate. And then the work that we are doing, I'm going to hand it over to Jules. The great work, Jules, that RMI is doing on Energy Web, where EPRI is partnering with you. Those are the type of technologies that will fully utilize what FERC 2222 enables you to do. But it won't happen unless the Public Utility Commissions are investing, are enabling the investment on grid modernization that will be needed to access these resources.
I completely agree with you, Arshad.
Me, Denny here. Can you hear me?
Hi, Denny. Yes, we can.
Listen, if anybody needs any technical assistance with information technology, please give me a call. I'll be able to help you out. I'm going to stick with just audio here. Rob, thank you so much for keeping the conversation going, but don't go too far away because the gremlins still may be around. Let me just say that this is a superb conversation. I've been able to monitor it. I'm really pleased to see so many folks that are involved with it. The chat has been very, very busy, and we've got some great team members from both RMI and EPRI that are addressing those as quickly as they come in. Also, as Hannah may have mentioned, we are going to have this recorded, and so you'll be able to come back and take some notes that you may not have because of the tremendous substance and the pace at which these issues are being addressed by Jules and Arshad. Arshad mentioned it in his opening remarks, but this type of a conversation between these two world-class technical innovative organizations would not have happened 10, even 5 years ago. And it is a tribute to their leadership and to their outreach and partnership in recognizing the tremendous changes that are taking place in the energy area. And we are at a perfect storm, if you will, as Arshad said, at the beginning of a new decade, beginning of a new administration, and absolutely compelling reasons to change our energy portfolio. So with that, Jules, why don't you pick up where Arshad said, and so far, I'm going to give you guys an A+. You're doing a really good job.
Thank you, Denny, and great to have you back, even if it is only on voice. Yeah, I think, Arshad, you made a very important point, right? We need to make that grid smart in order to allow the supply to interact with demand. And when it comes to the FERC ruling 2222, which basically enables the participation of distributed energy resources in the wholesale market, this now becomes even more important. So at RMI, about 3 years ago, we launched a spin-out organization called the Energy Web Foundation, which has created the blockchain infrastructure for the tying in of distributed energy resources into wholesale markets. It essentially allows my Tesla or my Nest thermostat to talk to other resources on the power grid and exchange information and bring the flexibility of those electrons to bear in the power markets. So we believe that there is a tremendous opportunity here, which is indeed, as you said, Arshad, why we are partnering to bring this to EPRI members. But it also requires utilities to really start driving that innovation internally. It requires utilities and grid companies to consider how do they enable this embedding of distributed energy resources into their power market approaches, such that we create that flexibility and we leverage everything that we've got on the other side of the meter. So it's a very exciting set of developments. It will push all of us, it will challenge all of us, but it is definitely one of the major priorities for the upcoming years. Denny, you're on mute.
Oh, okay. All right. So I set the three things that are absolutely essential to move forward. Obviously, technology, and we've been doing a lot of talking about that. But there are two other components as well. One is policy, and I'd appreciate your thoughts on what types of policy changes might be helpful at the national and subnational levels to accelerate this transition and to make the business case for having it happen quickly, profitably, and socially equitably. So why don't we start with Arshad? What do you think we need in the way of policies?
Danny, as you know, we are a technology company, but we do policy analysis because technology on its own will not be able to get there. I think innovation in policy and innovation in technology goes hand in hand. Let me just give a few examples that we see are critical. So first, I talked about a $1,000 reduction in the energy bill of an average U.S. household. That reduction is from together gasoline, electric, and natural gas bill. If you look at the way we regulate, gasoline is not regulated. Gas and electricity is regulated. But when we look at benefit cost of investing in charging infrastructure, we need to figure out how we have an integrated look across all three sectors. It can be just across electricity or natural gas or petroleum. So an integrated approach to policymaking will yield the maximum benefit in terms of reduced costs. So that's one. I think as we see 3x, 4x times wind and solar coming in, our power markets will have to also evolve. Energy is one thing. Having the energy available with this capacity is another thing. So when a question comes up, I saw a chat question, is wind and solar cheaper to build than coal? Oh, it's going to be cheaper. It's going to go down even more. We see 25% reduction on the cost of cents per kilowatt hour on wind and solar in the next 5 years. But that's energy. Now we got to make sure that we have enough capacity so that that energy can be used at any time during the coldest day in the winter and the hottest day in summer. And that capacity will come from flexible resources, would come from synchronous machines, and would come from other resources. So I think looking, again, an integrated view of both capacity and energy, both have to be equitably valued at the wholesale level and at the retail level. There are a number of other policy analyses that we have done, but I'm going to hand it over to Jules, because I think the integrated approach to decarbonization and from the electricity sector, making sure we are equitably valuing capacity and energy, both at the wholesale level and the retail level, could be two of the major components.
Jules, as you begin to address, what do you think about the roles of RMI and EPRI in educating policymakers so that they are aware of the potential, tremendous potential across the board in terms of technology, as well as what the potential costs and risks are?
Thank you, Danny. Yeah, that's a good additional question. Let me start by saying that Arshad is absolutely right, that thinking about how we structure power markets, both from a capacity and an energy point of view, is going to be absolutely critical, because the marginal cost of electrons in power markets at many moments in time are going to be approaching zero. So thinking through not just power, but also capacity is going to be crucial. I think we're going to get into a whole new world of policy formation under the Biden administration. And in my view, there are probably 4 areas that I'm going to be watching for. The first one is the role of policy in setting a long-term vision. Where we're going to go by the end of this decade, or by 2035, that President-elect Biden has said that he wants the power sector to be net zero. Where we're going to be by the middle of the century. That will create a very clear perspective for industries and companies around the country to know where we're going. Secondly, energy efficiency. It was already asked in the chat function at some point. Policy and regulations and product standards and building codes are going to continue to play an incredibly important role in driving energy efficiency. And we've seen that countries that are proactive in shaping their standards and their codes to drive efficiency make huge progress. Third, we'll see significant green stimulus coming out of this horrible pandemic. And that means that there will be an opportunity to leverage those infrastructure and stimulus bills to point towards the technologies and the infrastructure needs of the future for the energy system. So let me just give 2 examples. How and where and in which way are we going to use that infrastructure and green stimulus spending to drive the deployment of transmission, which is a significant enabler of more renewable deployments. And secondly, how can infrastructure packages help roll out that charging infrastructure that Arshad referred to earlier? And then finally, a policy arena where there might be possibilities under a Biden administration if we see shifts in the mindset on the other side of the aisle is by putting a price on carbon. Many economists still argue that a price on carbon, whether it is a cap and trade system or a tax and dividend or a straight carbon tax, that a price on carbon is the simplest, most straightforward, most powerfully enabling policy measure to drive the decarbonization of the economy. It's a question whether we'll see the political bandwidth and the political readiness to implement a policy along those lines. What is the role for EPRI and RMI in all of that? I think one very important thing for us to do is to help make sure that we have a common fact base, a common understanding of the state of play, not just in the United States, but in global energy markets for people in Washington, D.C. as they contemplate this. And by the way, that also holds true for state capitals. A common understanding of where we are and where we're going. Because things that Arshad and I are completely taking for granted, are fully aligned on, still seem to be to some extent controversial in the discussion between Democrats and Republicans on the Hill. The idea that wind and solar are the most cost-effective forms of power generation in the United States, bar none, that's maybe controversial for some in DC, but sort of a common understanding between the two organizations. So if we tell that story in an aligned fashion, if we stand side by side and help policymakers understand the realities of the energy transition, that will certainly help speed up the policy formation dialogue.
That's a key
Jules,
point,
if I may
Jules.
add one thing, one thing I wanted to add. We are ready to stand, hand in hand with you and others, so that our voice and our research informs. One of the areas that we also focus on, which is equally important, is the technical piece. We take this grid for granted. 99 out of 100 times you turn on the light bulb, the light comes on. We have a 99.9% reliability. The way we plan, the way we design, the way we operate, the way we protect the grid, that blueprint has come from the last 100 years. But that blueprint is changing. It's easy to say we're going to bring in a lot of DER. We're going to bring in a lot of 4x, 3x solar. But how do you protect the system when the system protection was based on a single-way power flow? It's not a matter of technology. A lot of research has happened. More needs to happen in a more urgent basis, because we need a new blueprint to plan, operate, protect, design the grid. And the grid just doesn't work on its own. It took hundreds and thousands of engineers and scientists to build an interconnected grid like you have in developed countries, which is 99.99% reliable. So I think keeping that reality in mind is also what we see one of EPRI's role, that we need to speak the truth about power to people in power. And that's part of our job as well.
Just as we take the grid for granted, as you just described, Arshad, bandwidth for granted, but no longer. I'm going to be cherishing those ones and zeros ever more. But here's a grid-related question. Mother Nature's been pretty rough on us past few years, 5 to 10. Hurricanes, heat waves, forest fires, etc. And every one of those affects the grid to one degree or another in large geographical areas or isolated areas. So this idea of not taking the grid for granted, but building in resiliency, absolutely critical. Thoughts on that, either one of you?
Yeah, that's such a crucial point, right? I completely agree with you, Danny. We're going to have to live with the consequences of global warming that is already baked in to the system, and therefore be prepared for more hurricanes, more floodings, more forest fires. So a couple of things. We need to make the grid smarter so that we can understand more quickly where there are problems, where there are hiccups, and have the smart technology deployed across the grid to be able to pinpoint the issues. Secondly, we need to build the grid in a more resilient fashion in terms of being able to island or to operate on a distributed fashion when the more centralized grid disappears. We will all remember the stories of the aftermath of Sandy, when people in New York who had solar on their roof thought, oh, we should be able to have power because we have solar, but the way in which it was engineered didn't allow them to directly use the solar from their roof, but only as it was fed back to them from the grid. So that's a second important part. And then being European, to me, it continues to be an interesting question. Can the United States ever get to the point where much more of the grid goes underground? It is more costly to do that. It is time consuming to do that. But by golly, it is more resilient at times of forest fires, hurricanes, and floods. And of course, in Puerto Rico, we're already talking about that after the two horrible storms that hit that island over the last couple of years. A resilient solution for the grid in Caribbean islands, where RMI does a lot of work, does require us to think about undergrounding parts of the grid. So those would be important elements in my mind of making our grid more resilient and more robust.
Let's talk money. It does require technology, policy, and finance. So for too long, especially in Washington, there was this, you can either have environmental quality or you can have a robust economy. But as we know, and as you and your teams fully embrace, our energy security, our economic security, and our environmental security are inextricably linked. So we need to consider all of them. So when I hear about the tremendous challenges of climate change, and we are experiencing them, as you pointed out, Jules, um, I think that we need to continue to make the case that, yes, it's a challenge, but gosh, if you crack that open, it is just full of opportunity to create new value chains, jobs. And if you look globally, not just in the United States, but globally, we are facing the ravages of the pandemic. We are in the subsequent or related economic challenges, and now and then of course dealing with climate change. But there's an opportunity, tremendous amount of opportunities to get win-win-win for economy, energy security, and environmental security. Thoughts? Go ahead and start, Arshad.
No, I think building on the resiliency discussion, we're talking about how to get to a net zero future. That's one side of the coin. And the other side of the coin is resiliency, because the greenhouse gas emission level will continue to increase year over, even with net zero. But another very important thing where resiliency will help us to make practical decisions in the decarbonization is, imagine you're in 2040, 2045. And imagine today, 20% of the energy we use is electricity. Imagine that's 40%. Imagine both of your cars are electric. Imagine we have electrified heating. What would be the need? Can you survive? The cost of undergrounding is a lot, but the cost of not making a resilient grid when the percent of energy use is going to be more and more electric, I think will be greater. And this is where we'll have to make prudent decisions. Maybe electrifying all heating is not the right answer. Maybe hybrid heating, where you bring in heat pumps and you have gas heating so that you have a resiliency option, is a better option. Maybe FedEx and Walmart, who all have come up with their plans to decarbonize their fleet operation by 2030, 2035, maybe it's not all electrified. Maybe some of it, you're using hydrogen, which is produced locally, clean electricity, and you have a combination of those. I think the reality, imagine if you were in Houston when you had the hurricane and there were 8-9 hours of traffic jam on highways and all those cars were electric. So resiliency of the grid, the ability to have a resilient energy system, I think is going to drive decisions that are not just based on what technology is the best, but it's also based on what is best for the society, because you don't want to lose power for 2 days when you have full electric heating and both of your cars are EV.
And you have to be willing to spend some money for that resilience, right? Back to Danny's question about the funding and the financing. You can't expect to reduce your cost and have reliable service and have it environmentally sustainable. You can do all three, but you may not have the ability to reduce your cost at the same time. So investing or willingness to invest in that resilience is an important point. I would say, Danny, also in response to what you just said, here's the good news. The cost of energy is going to go down. The cost of a unit of energy is going to go down. That's not a question any longer. We see the unrelenting learning curve. We see the cost reduction curves. But as part of the package of the total bill we pay, justifying the investment in capacity, in resilience, may mean that our total energy bill stays the same. It's a more efficient use of energy. It's cheaper electrons, but we pay a bit extra for resilience and for capacity. And then the question is, how do you finance that? Because if it is in the end the same or even a slightly lower energy bill, how do you finance that? And here's the good news. You look at the rate of interest that you currently get on your savings account, that indicates that there is plenty of capital in the world. There is more than enough capital. So it's just all back to structuring markets and creating the policy frameworks under which that capital flows to the investments that are going to be necessary. How do we make it easy to invest in EV charging infrastructure? How do we make it easy to invest in transmission infrastructure? Because that's what is going to be necessary. Now, clear leadership and a shared vision of where we're heading and a good direction coming from the federal government, coming from state utility commissions will help us all of that. So in that sense, I think we're on the cusp of a very important moment. And the fact that we're going to be spending money under a stimulus program allows us to make sure that that is directed in the right direction.
Denny, if you don't mind, I think one area, and I'm seeing the chat scrolling by, we may not have addressed it because the importance of addressing that is going to be huge. We talked about 3x, 4x times wind and solar. We talked about 4 out of 10 new cars electric. We talked about modernizing the grid. You're not going to get 3x, 4x time of wind and solar unless you figure out how to build significantly more transmission. The need for transmission to enable a 3x to 4x time is going to be critical. And you were asking a question on what are some of the policy imperatives. You got to wait 10 years to build a transmission line. You're not going to get to 3x, 4x solar and wind by 2030. So I think understanding the need for infrastructure that will enable us to get to a grid that can reliably integrate a large amount of wind and solar, that can operate with the nuclear power plants, that can bring in distributed energy resources as a flexible resource, and that can also make sure we have a resilient system, that will be important. So the need for transmission and then the need for policy that enables those decisions and deployments to happen in an accelerated way is also key to accelerate to a net zero future.
Right. As you and your teams think through, work through, and scale up this transition to a new energy economy, how do you address the challenges of underserved communities? What are the ways in which you can combine the right mix of technology, policy, and finance to bring all of the benefits of the new energy economy to underserved communities?
I'll go in first, Jules, because go ahead, Jules.
It's a very good question, Danny, and it's incredibly important in our agenda at the moment. The first thing to take note of is that whether it is coal plants or even some inner city gas plants, the pollution associated with that infrastructure hits predominantly underserved communities, the most vulnerable people. And so making this transition will benefit those communities. But we have to do it in a way where people are also enabled to make the personal transition from being involved in one part of the energy industry to new parts of the energy industry. And as you already pointed out, then, all of this is going to create jobs left, right, and center. Massive job creation associated with energy efficiency, with the installation of that 3 to 4 times larger energy or electricity system. So many jobs are going to be created. How do we make sure that those are good jobs, that those are jobs that pay a decent wage, that those are jobs that provide benefits, so that people are not seeing great jobs disappear in the old energy economy in return for less good jobs in the new energy economy. And then finally, I'll say, here is another exciting part of the equation. As Arshad was already pointing out, for many people right now, one of the largest costs after their home or their house, their rent or their mortgage, is their car, is the fuel they pay. That cost is going to come down. Once we see that tipping point of electric vehicles becoming cheaper upfront than internal combustion engines, that should allow us to create mechanisms to help people with fuel poverty and with the cost of their mobility. But it's again a question of financing, because if I'm driving a clunker now, I might not be able to afford the financing on a brand new EV. So how are we going to put in place the financing that allows people at the bottom of the pyramid to make that transition from the more costly technologies of the past to the more cost-effective technologies of the future?
Outstanding. Arshad?
I think I'll promote our EPRI social media platform and LinkedIn. We asked a question to our researchers, and we actually had a 1-hour discussion with Biden's energy transition team on how does equity environmental justice gets baked in, not just in EPRI's research, but any infrastructure deployment we will do. So we have put together a nice 2 to 3 page that looks at all of EPRI's research and see how we can address those issues. So stay online. If you're not connected with us on Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn, make the connection. We will bring that up in the next coming weeks, because that may be the most important near-term imperative. Is an average U.S. household is already paying 10% of their disposable income on energy. We got to make sure that this transition doesn't require them to pay any more. And also this transition, yes, coal plants will be replaced, but these large plants, coal, natural gas, nuclear, is the tax base of predominantly rural communities. So if you replace them, let's use those brownfield for the next generation clean energy part. So there's many of these examples that we hopefully in the next coming weeks we will put in our social media, because that is a key thing that we always take into consideration as we are looking into this clean energy transition.
Great. We are coming up on the end of a fascinating hour in conversation. So why don't we start with Jules? Give us a 1-minute summary of your hope and aspirations, Jules, Arshad, and then I'll say a few concluding remarks.
Here is the summary, exciting comment from my perspective. We've mentioned it before. 5 years, 10 years ago, this sort of dialogue would have been quite unlikely. And look how much consensus, how much passion and excitement, how much overlap in thinking there now is between Rocky Mountain Institute and EPRI. And I'm looking forward to working more closely together than ever over the next years with Arshad and his team. And I think we're going to move mountains. Thank you.
Great.
Denny, I'm going to end up, we will move mountains, and we will do that by supercharging innovation. We will do that by supercharging deployment of technologies like EV charging, wind and solar, and batteries that have already come in. But I think a bigger opportunity for the society in this next 10 years, decade, is while we are reducing and accelerating the reduction, we need to invest a lot of money on R&D, because the technology we will need in 2040, 2035 needs to be done by the next 10 years. And that's the low carbon resources. That's how do we affordably create clean molecules from clean electricity. So let's not lose sight on the research that is needed in this decade that will help us in 2040, but let us also make sure we all come together so that we know what we need to do in the next 10 years. And I think the path is clear. The next 10 years, the path is clear. We just need to get technology policy aligned.
Right on. And for everybody, all of our participants in this webinar, thank you. Let the conversation go. EPRI.org, RMI.org, wealth of information by both organizations. And as you can see from the conversation we've just had, this is all about partnership. This is all about putting together the best idea is to scale and deploy it as quickly as possible. It's a win for the economy, it's a win for energy security, and it's certainly a win for the environment. So thank you very much, and we look forward to continuing the conversation in the future. Take care.
Thank you, Danny. Thanks.